Why are they all different? Well, I'll ask the question a little bit differently. If we can read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we can see the differences in there in Gospels that are only written about 10 years, 20 years apart from each other, Mark's written in 70 AD, Matthew and Luke are written 80, 85 AD, and John's written about 90 AD, so a 20-year span, we can read these different Gospels, and in a 20-year period, we can definitely prove that people were changing the story. If that's what they were doing, and these are our most reliable Gospels, how could you possibly ever make the argument that they didn't change the stories from 30 AD to 40 AD? Yo, welcome back to another Bible study with me. My name is Adam Jordan Clark, and today we are going to be talking about Matthew chapter 22. For those of you who are just landing on this video for the very first time, we are doing a Bible study on the Gospel of Matthew, and we're going through every single chapter. Now, we're in chapter 22 because we've already done all the other chapters up to 22. There are 28 chapters in the entire gospel. We're on chapter 22, so basically it means we're coming up toward the end of this series. And it's been very fun. We've learned lots of stuff. We looked at some history and some theology and some spirituality. And we've really learned a lot about the Gospel of Matthew. The whole goal of this series has been to emphasize some stuff that scholars have known about for a while that the church doesn't necessarily always talk about. One thing that we really focused on the most is how Matthew, the tax collector, did not write the Gospel of Matthew, and how it's probably an anonymous gospel. The other thing that we focused on a lot is the date of the book. The church will tell you it's written about 50 AD. We're saying it was probably written about 80 to 85 AD. This is going to be important because today we're in Matthew chapter 22. Tomorrow we'll be in Matthew 23, and then we'll be in Matthew 24, and we'll be in Matthew 25. It's important to understand this stuff because this is where Jesus gets into a fight with the Jews, and then he predicts the destruction of Jerusalem that occurred in 70 AD. Now understand that the destruction of Jerusalem occurred in 70 AD. And we're saying that Matthew wrote this gospel 10 or 15 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. In other words, he's writing with the knowledge of the destruction of Jerusalem. So it makes Matthew 24 not a prophecy that was recorded before Jerusalem is destroyed. Now, people got problems with that because they're just very dogmatic about this stuff. But look, you got to understand something. Just because something's written afterwards does not mean it's not recording authentic prophecy. Okay, so understand that point right there. Jesus obviously predicts the temple. We know that because Mark is written about 70 AD, and Jesus predicts the gospel there. And Matthew copied from Mark. About 95% of Mark's gospel is found in Matthew. About 50-60% of it is word-for-word quotations. So, got to understand here, this is where the Gospel of Matthew starts speeding up and taking off, and we're coming up to Jesus' trial, and we're going to start seeing why he's going to be arrested. And yesterday he just came into the city of Jerusalem, and so now he's in Jerusalem, and basically this is how he gets caught. This is how he gets captured. This is how he gets arrested, and eventually he'll be put to death over the next couple of chapters. And it's going to be really fun to read all this stuff, and it's going to be really fun to read all this stuff. So, but understand that we're saying we don't know who wrote the Gospel of Matthew because the Gospel doesn't tell us. We're saying it's definitely not the Matthew the tax collector because it doesn't say that it's Matthew the tax collector. It just says the Gospel according to Matthew. We don't know which one that is, so we're not going to say. We're not going to speculate. But the gospel is telling us that it is written later. It's not written in 50, 55, 60 AD. It's definitely written 80 to 85 AD. It's definitely written after the destruction of Jerusalem. It's very important to understand that. So as we read this chapter, just keep that in mind, that whoever wrote Matthew's gospel is writing with the knowledge of the destruction of Jerusalem. So let's go ahead and jump into the text. But before we do, here's an ungodly, ugly picture of Matthew chapter 22, which of course I put this picture in every single one of these videos because I think that it's funny, and you may not think it's funny, but I'm the guy making the video, and it means I get to put whatever I want in my video, and I decided to put this ugly picture in there because it brings joy to my little tiny heart. By the way, I'll also tell you this. Last night, I don't know what it is, but I must have allergies or something. But last night, in the middle of the night, I started getting, my throat started, just swelling up and closing up. And so now I have like this slight cold going on / allergies. I don't know what it is, but it is just horrible. So I'm going to try and make this video short. I'm going to speed through it. But yeah, if my voice sounds weird at times, just know it's because I got a little sickness going on here. Anyways. This is Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. There's about 45, 50 verses in this chapter, so it's going to be a little bit of time to go through it. So we're just going to go ahead and read it, and then try and find some stuff to talk about. Beginning in verse 1, here's what it reads. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his sons. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent more servants and said, 'Tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fatted cattle have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged, and he sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their cities. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invite did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find.' So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guest, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. He asked, 'How did you get in here without wearing wedding clothes, my friend?' The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, 'Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen.' Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap Jesus in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. And they said, 'Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?' But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, 'You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying taxes.' They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, 'Whose image is upon this, and whose inscription?' 'Caesar,' they said. And he said to them, 'So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's.' And when they heard this, they were amazed. So they left him and went away. The same day, the Sadducees, who say that there was no resurrection, came to him with a question. 'Teacher,' they said, 'Moses told us that if a man dies without having children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for him. Now there were 7 brothers among them. The first one married and died, and since he had no children, he left his wife to his brother. The same thing happened to the second and the third, right down to the 7th. Finally, the woman died. Now then, at the resurrection, Whose wife will be of the 7, since all of them were married to her? Jesus replied, You are in error, because you do not know the Scripture nor the power of God. At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be given like the angel. They will be like the angels in heaven. But about the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what God said to you? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teachings. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with the question, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment? And Jesus replied, Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second one is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hinge upon these 2 commandments. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, What do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he? The son of David, they replied. And he said to them, How is it then that David, speaking by the Spirit, calls him Lord? For he says, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand until I will put your enemies under your feet. If then David calls him Lord, how can he be his son? No one could say a word in reply, and for that day on, no one dared to ask him any more questions. So that's the entire reading of Matthew chapter 22. And I just want to mention really something very quickly about this last part. It says, No one could say a word in reply from that day on, and no one dared to ask him any more questions. Now, what exactly do they mean by that day on? Because as we read this chronology, what we'll find out is just in a couple of days, Jesus will be arrested and killed. So what exactly does this statement really mean? Well, this is where we start to see some confusion in Matthew's own gospel in and of himself, where he sort of gets some of the confusion mixed up. Also, at the same time, I told you at the beginning of this series, and all throughout the series, by the way, that when you go to church and you ask them who the audience is, they're going to say, Matthew is a Jewish gospel. And for the sake of this study that we're doing, we're saying, no, it's a Gentile gospel. That's what we're saying. And the reason why we're doing that is because we want to, first of all, I'm trying to teach you how to read the Bible differently. That's the most important thing. If you want to be a good Bible interpreter, if you want to be a good Bible expositor, if you want to be a good preacher, a good evangelist, a good teacher, you're going to have to learn how to read the Bible very much differently than what you're used to. You're going to have to learn how to read the Bible different ways. It's very important. It's called hermeneutics. It's the study and art of interpretation. You got to learn how to do it. So that's what I'm trying to teach you here, is how to read the Bible a lot differently, particularly reading the Bible differently than what you've been taught in church. So understand that. We're saying the gospel of Matthew is a Gentile gospel, meaning it's written to a Gentile, by a Gentile, for Gentiles. It's not Jewish. We'll start to see this stuff unraveling. We've already seen it. In the beginning of this chapter, what does Jesus say? He says, you hypocrites. Keep that in mind. This is a Jew talking to a Jew, or talking to Jewish people, and he calls them hypocrites. Okay? That does not sound very Jewish. That sounds anti-Jewish. And as we get to tomorrow, when we get into chapter 23 and we get into chapter 24 and then we get into chapter 25, we'll see Jesus start saying, you brood of vipers, and you hypocrites, and you liars, and this, that, and he'll start calling them really bad names. The question is why? If this is a Jewish gospel, why would it have this strong tone against the Jews? The entire gospel of Matthew is against the Jews. And the question is why? How can it be a Jewish gospel if it's against the Jews? And so that's why we're saying it's Gentile. Now, it may not be a Gentile gospel, and it may not be a Jewish gospel. But either way, you're going to have to learn how to read this gospel as Jewish and Gentile. If you want to be a good expositor, if you want to be a good interpreter, you want to be a good teacher or a good preacher or a good pastor or a good evangelist or just a good student of the Bible, you're going to have to learn how to read the Bible many different ways. So, coming back up here to the top, verses 1 to 7, I have talked to you a lot about the dating of the book of Matthew. And I've told you, you go to church, and what the people in church are going to tell you is it's written in 50 AD. And what we're saying is not written in 50 AD, it's written 80 to 85 AD, and it's written with the knowledge of the destruction of Jerusalem. And one piece of evidence where this idea comes from is in this parable of the wedding banquet. Particularly this verse right here. It's Matthew 22, verse 7. It says, "The king was enraged, and he sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city." Now, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what he's talking about here. He's talking about Jerusalem. Okay? He draws this parable, so let me backtrack real quick. God has sent prophets. He sent a lot of prophets to Israel. Okay? And the whole Old Testament's about these prophets. John the Baptist was a prophet. Jesus was a prophet. He sent them there. And what this banquet parable is telling us is that God sent them, and the people of Israel rejected the prophets, and they rejected God, and they rejected his Messiah, and they rejected his message. And so now what's God going to do? He's going to kill them, right? So the king was enraged, and he sent his army, and he had the city burned. What happens in Jerusalem? Well, Titus comes in, surrounds the city. He cuts off the food supply, and he basically starves everybody over a couple of months. And then afterwards, according to Josephus, who was apparently there, he was a negotiator, he was interpreter for Titus, okay, because Josephus was a Jew, and he was also a slave. We talked a little bit about that in the last video when we did Matthew chapter 21. But listen, Titus goes into the city, and according to Josephus, here's what happens. The Roman army went into Jerusalem, and they murdered every man, woman, and child. They did not leave anybody alive. They slaughtered the entire city. Everybody who was left, everybody who was still alive after they started the city out, they slaughtered them all. They murdered everybody. And then what they do? They burned the temple, and they burned the entire city. They destroyed every building, and they destroyed everything. Go look it up today. Type in the Dome of the Rock. Where the temple in Jerusalem used to be. There's a new building there. It's called the Dome of the Rock, and it's a Muslim. What are they called? Their churches. I can't think of the name right now, but it's their churches or whatever. It's called the Dome of the Rock. It's right there. They built it over top of it. Why? Because the temple was destroyed. Okay. Also, I did a whole series on this stuff, and I've done some videos on something called preterism and partial preterism. And I've tried to explain this to people a lot about the book of Revelation and preterism and 70 AD and blah, 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 all that stuff. Just to give you a good understanding of what all that stuff means without going into all these crazy details. Let me just bring you up to speed real quick. In this modern age that we live in, there are two popular views about the end times, Jesus' second coming, the rapture, and all that stuff. One view is preterism. The other one is called futurism. I did a whole series on this. I did a whole series on the end times. We're still putting videos out in the end times, so we're still talking about it. It's something we talk about here on this channel. And preterism basically believes that all the prophecy in the New Testament was fulfilled in 70 AD when Jerusalem was destroyed by Titus. That's what they believe. Now, it's obviously nonsense, and these people have no idea what they're talking about. I did a whole video on this. It's called Preterism is Heresy, because preterism is heresy. And lots of people get upset about that video. Whatever, I don't care. But it is heresy. The other view is futurism. And they believe that some of the stuff in the Bible is still future. And a lot of it has to deal with Matthew 24, which we'll get into in the next couple of chapters in the next couple of days. The point of the matter is this. When you read this passage, Matthew chapter 22, and you read about the wedding banquet, it's interesting because Matthew is telling you that he's writing with the knowledge of the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, this is a big problem for preterism, and it's a big problem for futurism. Okay? That's why I like to tell people that everybody's wrong. I like to say that all the time. It's like, you're all wrong, and people are like, what do you mean by, how could you say that? It's like, well, I just did, because it's funny. But this is a big problem you have to deal with. Knowing that Matthew's gospel is written after 70 AD, and he knows about it, and he's using knowledge of it. There's no way getting around this passage here, where he says, the king was enraged, and he sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. The murderers that he's talking about are the Jews, and burning their city is talking about Jerusalem. There's no getting around that. It's very hard to argue that any differently. And there are arguments out there, for sure. But it's pretty clear to me that this is a passage that's talking about Jerusalem being destroyed. I mean, in all honesty, what else is he talking about here? It says, Jesus spoke to them again in a parable, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. Who's the king? It's God. Who's his son? Jesus. Verse 3, he sent his servants. Who would the servants be? That would be the prophets. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet. Okay, who are those that he's referring to? It's talking to the Jews. He invited the Jews to the banquet. And they said, nope, we're not doing that. And so what did they do? Well, they killed them. They killed the servants. It says down here, it says, but they paid no attention, and they went off, one to his field and another to his business. And then they seized his servants and mistreated them and killed them. Then the king was enraged, and he sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. When you read this passage right here about his sending his army and destroying the city and burning it, and you compare it to the next chapter over, Matthew 23, when Jesus is yelling and screaming at the Jews, and he's saying, you brood of vipers, you hypocrites, you evil people, God's going to kill you, he's going to destroy you people because you rejected him. That's what it says in the next chapter over. And then Matthew 24, his disciples come to him and said, Jesus, what are you talking about? We never heard you talk like this before. And he says, not one stone will be left upon another, yada, 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 yada. Here's what's going to happen. Jerusalem's going to be burned. It's going to be destroyed. That's what he explains in Matthew 24. It's also in Luke 21. Luke 21 is obviously written with the knowledge as well. It's very important to understand that stuff. It's very important to understand that this gospel is written after the destruction of Jerusalem that occurred in 70 AD. And that's one of the things that we've really tried to emphasize in this series, because reading the gospel this way, again, you don't have to believe this, okay? You can believe whatever you want to. I don't care. What I'm trying to do is teach you how to read the Bible differently, okay? That's what this Bible study is about. It's about giving you knowledge. It's not about taking beliefs and shoving them down your throat and saying, you have to believe this. This is about knowledge. And you know, the old saying is knowledge is power. Well, the only way to get knowledge is if you have the willpower to learn that knowledge. Do you have the willpower to watch this whole series and pay attention to it? And read the Gospel of Mark, and read the Gospel of Matthew, and read the Gospel of Luke, and compare them to one another, and be critical in your thoughts, and think about things historically, and think about things theologically, and think about things spiritually, and think about, maybe Matthew the tax collector did not write this Gospel. Think about the idea that maybe this Gospel is not an eyewitness account. By the way, it's not an eyewitness account. None of the Gospels are eyewitnesses. But the problem is that when you go to church, they tell you that they are eyewitnesses. But I'll also tell you this. The church people have gotten a little bit clever here, because now they're starting to say, they used to say back in the day, these are eyewitness accounts. They used to say that. Now they're stepping back a little bit because some scholars came out and put out some good books. And now they're starting to say, it's based on eyewitness accounts. But they slipped that word based in there. Like, it's based on eyewitness accounts. I don't really think a lot of these pastor people, church people, YouTube people really know what they mean when they say based on eyewitness accounts. I really don't think they understand what that means. But I do. And so basically, here's the thing. The Gospel of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, none of them are eyewitness accounts. For sure, 100%. They're not written by eyewitnesses. Being based on eyewitness accounts, what exactly does that mean? Well, here's what it really means. Someone told someone who told someone who told someone who told someone who eventually wrote it down, and then someone else wrote it down, and then someone else wrote it down, and then one of these gospel writers read one of those books, and then they wrote their gospel based on that book. That's what based on eyewitness account means. People say, I don't like that idea, son. You don't know what you're talking about. Well, I mean, I don't really think that you know what you're talking about, because that's what we're getting here. Open up your Bible to Luke chapter 1, and read verses 1 through 4. What does he say? He says, I'm not an eyewitness. He says, many have taken it upon their task to compile accounts and tell the stories about Jesus. He says, many have tried to do this. And then he goes on to say, look, I've read these accounts. He doesn't tell us what the accounts are, but he says, look, I've read these accounts. And I've gone through them and I've consulted them and I've constructed my own account based on this stuff that I've been reading. AKA, I picked out what I thought was good and got rid of the rest of the stuff, which you have to ask the question, was Luke right? Did Luke get it right? Well, we don't know. He doesn't tell us what his sources are, so we can't compare them. We have no idea. All we know is that there was some type of orthodox belief in Luke's community, and he read all these different gospels, and after he read all these gospels, he picked stuff based on what his community was already saying. How do we know that? Because he says, O Theophilus, I'm writing to you to assure to you, to give you the certainty of the things that you've already been instructed in. In other words, this group of people or this person, whether it's a group of people or a person, nobody really knows, but whoever he's writing to had doubts about Jesus and the apostles. And he wrote this account to reassure them of what they've already been taught. That's what Luke's gospel is. That's what the book of Acts is about. That's why it was written. Okay? So you have to understand, when you say they're based on eyewitness accounts, you have to understand what that means. It's not they read one or two gospels that were really, really reliable from eyewitness accounts, and that's what eyewitness means. That's not what it means. That's not what Luke tells us, particularly in Luke's gospel. Luke tells us that there are many people, and he consulted these sources. Well, he's also implying here that there are false gospels. We know there are false gospels because we have those gospels. They've surfaced over the centuries. So did he read them? Again, we don't know what he read and what he didn't read. We don't know what he accepted and what he didn't accept because he doesn't tell us what his sources were. He just says that many have taken it upon themselves to write these accounts. I've read those accounts. I've carefully considered them, and I basically picked out the information that I thought that was the best. That's what Luke tells you. If you don't believe me, open up your Bible and read Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. It's the prologue. It's the very first verses. He tells you why he's writing this gospel. But you have to understand that when we talk about being based on eyewitnesses, what we mean is this. Someone told someone who told someone who told someone. Why do we think that? Well, here's why. Jesus and the apostles lived about 30 AD, 40 AD. They spoke Aramaic. More than likely, they spoke Aramaic. The Gospels are written in Greek. That's a totally different language. So the gospel that's originally preached is preached in Aramaic, which is a form of Hebrew. So it's obvious, there's no getting around that. It's obviously oral tradition here. Very early on oral tradition. 10, 20, 30, 40 years go by, and someone says, well, we got to write this down. They don't write it down in Aramaic. They write it down in Greek. So, if you're going to say that Peter is an eyewitness or a source for Mark's gospel, you're going to have to argue for some type of translation. You're going to have to be able to explain that type of translation. And trust me, it's not easy. So I actually think that, there's lots of stuff here that, you can go and look into this stuff if you want. It's called source criticism if you want to. But the point of the matter is that when we say based on eyewitness accounts, you have to understand what we're talking about. We're talking about someone told someone who told someone who told someone orally. This is an oral tradition. And then somebody decided, well, we got to write this down. So they wrote it down. And then someone copied it and copied it and copied and copied it and copied it and copied it. And then eventually we get the Gospel of Mark. And then we get the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John. Now here's where things get very bizarre. We can read Mark, we can read Matthew, and we can read Luke, and we can read John. And they're all talking about Jesus and his disciples. But you know what's amazing? They're all different. Why are they all different? Well, I'll ask the question a little bit differently. If we can read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we can see the differences in there in Gospels that are only written about 10 years, 20 years apart from each other, Mark's written in 70 AD, Matthew and Luke are written 80, 85 AD, and John's written about 90 AD, so a 20-year span. We can read these different gospels, and in a 20-year period, we can definitely prove that people were changing the story. If that's what they were doing, and these are our most reliable gospels, how could you possibly ever make the argument that they didn't change the stories from 30 AD to 40 AD? From 30 AD to 70 AD, when this oral tradition is going on, and when this other writing tradition is going on. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Look, what I'm ultimately telling you is this. There are differences, and the reason why there are differences is because people are changing the stories, and they're getting the details mixed up, and they're getting the details wrong. And, do the details really matter? No, they don't. They don't change the story at all. It doesn't matter. I mean, really what we're talking about is details. I mean, in all honesty, the Jesus story is pretty easy to remember. He comes on the scene, he's baptized by John the Baptist. Afterwards, he turns into a miracle man by the Holy Spirit. He heals a bunch of people, and then he goes to Jerusalem, and he gets arrested, and he dies on a cross, and then 3 days later, he rises. I mean, that's the whole... he had 12 followers, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, and there was some guy named Thomas. That's about it. The other guys, who cares what their names are? And then they went to Jerusalem, and they stayed in Jerusalem or whatever, and then they started the church. I mean, that's the story of Christianity in a nutshell. Do the details matter? No, they don't. I mean, that's the story of Jesus. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. By the way, let me also tell you this. If you're doubting oral tradition, or you don't think oral tradition is reliable, just look at your modern church today. Okay, here in America and all around the world, we rely on oral tradition. Okay, most people do not read their Bibles. Most of the knowledge that people have of the Bible comes from their pastor or their Bible study or whatever. We have an oral tradition. It still exists today. The only difference is that we can look at that oral tradition and compare it to the Bible. And you know what? Most of the time, we get it right. Most of the time, we get it right. John 3:16. How many people have actually ever read that Bible passage? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. How many people have actually read that? The answer is not a lot. In other words, they didn't read the passage and then memorize it. The reason why they have it memorized is because they heard it from someone else. How do they know that Jesus healed the blind and made eyes open up, and he raised from the dead on the third day, and he died for your sins, and all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God? How do they know about that passage? For the wages of sin is death. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. It's for by grace you have been saved through faith. How do people know these passages? It's not because they're reading the Bible and they're memorizing them. It's because they're hearing it in church culture. They're hearing it in their Bible studies. They're hearing it on YouTube channels. It's the Christian culture. It's the oral tradition of the church. And guess what, guys? We get it right. All right? We can bring 20 or 30 people in here who've never been Christian in their life. They didn't grow up in church. We can put them in a Bible study for 4 or 5 months, or even shorter time than that. We could put them in one Bible study for 1 hour and, just tell them some basic stuff about Christianity. All is sin and fall short of the glory of God. That's one of those Bible passages you hear and you remember it the rest of your life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. That's a Bible passage you hear one time and you'll remember it the rest of your life. And so on and so on and so on. So you have to understand, when we talk about the oral tradition from 30 AD to 40 AD or whatever it was, we don't know how long it was, you have to understand that, they get the details wrong just like you get the details wrong. I'm sure there are Bible passages that you have remembered in different versions of the Bible. So, for example, you have stuff memorized in the King James that you don't have memorized in the NIV or the New Living Translation. These are differences. Trust me, they're differences. And those differences do have some impact. They do have some type of significance. However, at the same time, the basic message is still there. Jesus died on the cross for your little sins, and if you give your little heart to Jesus, you get to go up in the sky with him. It's not that hard to remember. Jesus was a miracle-working man. If you believe in Jesus, guess what? I mean, that passage where it says, if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, and you just believe, all things are possible for those who believe. With man, it's impossible. But with God, nothing's impossible. We go on and on and on and on. We can see the reliability of this tradition because, again, we're not memorizing stuff that's hard. We're memorizing some stories, some parables, some basic teachings, and that's about it. So it's nothing very complicated. Understand, but I am telling you that there are changes and there are differences in oral tradition. How significant were those changes? I don't really think that they were that significant at all. Because one thing is definitely true of history. The disciples believed in the resurrection. Now, whether or not the resurrection happened, that's a topic for a different time, but they believed that they saw the risen Jesus after he was crucified. That's why they started preaching the gospel, because if you remember, Jesus gets arrested, they all leave. Well, you got to explain how they came back. Well, they came back because they came to this belief that Jesus rose from the dead. And then they all go out and start preaching this gospel that Jesus is raised from the dead. And then what happens? They all get killed for it. They all die. That's a little bit of a problem for skeptics, if you will, atheist people. If you want to say that dead people don't rise from the dead, okay, fine. You're absolutely right. Dead people don't rise from the dead, obviously. But apparently, the disciples believed that he did. So you have to explain that. And the only two ways to explain that these days is to say, yes, the Bible is true, or to say they hallucinated. And the hallucination theory is not very good, because we're talking about a lot of people who had a lot of hallucinations. Or, I'm sorry, a lot of people who had the same hallucination at different times. That's very difficult to explain. Either way, it's a miracle. You either have the miracle of Jesus rising from the dead, or you have the miracle of hallucination. I don't know which one you want to go with, but they're both miraculous. So anyways, the point is, there are some changes. The changes don't matter. There's some differences, and the differences don't matter. But if you're doubting the oral tradition of Christianity, there's no reason to do it. Okay? Because we do it today. We still do it. The same tradition that existed early on still happens today. Now, we don't know what existed in that early tradition. They could have changed a lot of stuff. They could have. We don't have any evidence of that, though. We don't. We know that there are changes in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We can see them. We can read them. We know they're there. There's no reason in pretending like they're not there, because they're there. The question is, are those changes significant? Some of them are. Most of them are not. Again, the basic story is there. Jesus died. Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. He was a miracle man. He healed people, blah, 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 blah. He came to die on your sins. He's arrested. He gets thrown on the cross. He dies. 3 days later, he rises up from the dead. His disciples apparently see him. And then they go preach the gospel. Oh, he taught in parables and he was a teacher. I mean, that's basically it. Do the details matter? No. What you'll find in modern Christianity, most people argue over the details. We call these semantic debates. They argue over how things should be said or how things shouldn't be said. In the grand scheme of things, almost everybody agrees that this is the story. Even atheists agree that this is the story of Jesus. So there's no reason to doubt it. Everybody knows the story of Jesus, okay? There's no reason to doubt the reliability of that basic story. And let me tell you something. There's no scholar in the world who's doubting the basic story. Everybody says the basic story is there. It definitely happened. Scholars talk about the little stuff. Scholars talk about the sources. How significant are these changes? There might be one or two changes that are really significant, but how significant are those changes? Those are the things that scholars talk about. You don't talk about those things in church. Scholars talk about those things in universities and in books and blah, 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 blah. Stuff you'll never hear about, most likely. Anyways, tomorrow we're going to be in Matthew chapter 23, and we're going to see how Jesus, starts heating up the arguments about the Jews, and he starts saying, hey, people, you brood vipers and you hypocrites. He's going to get really angry with these people, and we're going to see this little lovey-dovey Jesus that you think you know all about get real angry really, really, really quick, and he's going to say some bad stuff. Real bad stuff. It's going to be awesome, because this is where the gospel just goes, and all kinds of crazy stuff happens. One of my favorite parts in the Gospel of Matthew is basically from here on out. It's just, this is where the gospel gets really good. So it's exciting. It's fun. If you've never read this stuff before, join me. Go ahead and click subscribe and, follow the series, because it's going to be awesome. But anyways, this has been the entire video, and, tomorrow we'll be in Matthew 23, so don't forget that. Give this video a thumbs up and a like, and comment below if you want to know something or you want to tell me something. I like reading stories. I like reading your comments, so go ahead and comment and tell me what it is on your mind. But as always, I'll see you in the next video. If you like this video and want to know more, you can hit the subscribe button for more videos. If you have a question or a comment, or maybe you just like to say something or express your opinion, go ahead and comment that below. And like the video if you like the video, because liking the video is always a good thing when you like the video. My name is Adam Jordan Clark, and you can find out more about me if you like at my website, adamjordanclark.com. And as always, I will see you in the next video.